Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our third week of New Testament study. Now, this is the week where I'm sure we'll get to something that you all have been anticipating for quite a while. This is the week where we'll actually be introducing the four Gospels, the thing that stereotypically the New Testament is centered around. And so before we really delve into this new topic of study, we are going to go over what we have learned previously and make those connections. And now we are going to talk about a very quick review. Now, if you'll remember, in Chapter 1, our Unit 1 plan focused mainly upon the historical significance surrounding the New Testament. We talked a little bit about the creation myth of Gnosticism and how that played into how we see Christ. Does anyone remember doing that? Good. I thought so. And we also talked about some of the creation myths that come along with some Christ-like figures that come from mystery religions. Now, can anyone tell me what a mystery religion is? Yes? Great job, absolutely. A mystery religion, as you all should recall, is a religion that we see predominantly in Hellenistic or Roman culture. However, interestingly enough, this mystery religion is focused upon some sort of eternal life. So, for example, we talked about the followers of Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of wine, as you all may know from your other mythological classes, as well as this one, was a god that was semi-human, had a parent that was divine, had a parent that was not divine, that was mortal. Now, does that sound familiar to a figure of the New Testament? Christ, exactly, yes. This figure sounds a little bit like we think of Christ, is it not? Christ is a figure that is almost a demigod, has one foot on earth and one foot in heaven, metaphorically, so to speak. And so we see that this notion of a Christ-like figure is not an entirely new one, is it? No, it was something that was very predominant, at least prevalent, in the culture from whence the Bible was written, or the New Testament at least was written. And so we see that a lot of the historical context that we've been talking about, that you all have been drudging through thus far, it really is quite significant whenever we look into the four Gospels as we know them. Because if some of these legends and this mythology that was very prevalent in the culture at that time, I'm sure that you'll know that this cultural aspect really comes to light in the New Testament as well. So a lot of things we read here in the New Testament will not be isolated. So this review of what you're covering, it'll definitely come up time and time again. Okay? Are you ready to move on to the next topic of conversation? Good. Well, remembering Chapter 2, our Unit 2 plan, was to cover some of the distinctions that occurred in Hellenistic culture and between some of the Jewish officials of that time. And we talked about the Pharisees, we talked about the Sadducees. So can anyone tell me the main roles of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, if you all will remember, were two figures, and they were both Semitic, they were both Jewish, but they had different roles within the temple and within the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, I'll write that on the board for you all. The Sanhedrin was sort of the head of a Jewish theocracy. Because if you remember, a theocracy was something that was not unusual to Jewish society at this time. Roman society was also a theocracy, and it was predominant in that time. It wasn't anything that was unusual. I know that hearing theocracy is something that we, as contemporary Western world individuals, or even people of other countries, that may sort of strike us as being odd. We're not used to hearing about theocracies in practice. But this wasn't something that was necessarily viewed as having a negative connotation in that time. To these people, it was very practical. So in other words, the temple leaders, the priests, which were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they would also have a part in ruling the court system. And so keeping this in mind, the court system would operate within the Sanhedrin. Okay, so that's just a quick review of what we covered thus far. I appreciate y'all being patient with me while we do that, because this knowledge that we've already learned in the first couple of weeks will really be quite fundamental in shaping our understanding of these four Gospels as we know it. So without further ado, we are going to talk about the Gospels themselves, a quick crash course. And next week, whenever we have a bit more time, we will go into each Gospel in more detail, namely Mark first, and we'll go through them chronologically as they appear in the Bible. Are y'all excited? Great. Glad to hear it. Okay, so the first thing we are going to talk about is a quick historical background of some of the text, some of the time. And so if you think about it, I'll give you all just a moment to rhetorically ask yourselves, how long do you think it took for the four Gospels to be collected together, or at least to have been written? Do you think it was 10 years? Do you think it was 5 years? Do you think it was more or less? Well, actually, as we can see, as I'll put on the board for you all to observe, it took quite a while for the four Gospels that we know. There were others written, but they were not canonized. We talked about the process of canonization in chapter 1. It took a while for those four Gospels to be considered canon, and at least to have been written. And so you all may be pleasantly surprised to see how long of a period of time that took to take place. And so the first Gospel that was chronologically written was the Gospel of Mark. And now Mark was written during a time period scholars have estimated between the years 66 and 70 CE. Okay, so scholars have also pinned down historically the time period when Jesus may have been born, just a guesstimate. And so this guesstimate of when Jesus may have been born, as we'll cover later, so I won't write it on the board this time, is around 30 CE. So you can see that Mark is a really interesting, closer time period to Jesus than some of the other Gospels that we will read later. And so the first Gospel written was Mark, and the last Gospel written was the Gospel of John. John was written more or less, as scholars would believe, between the years 95 and 100 CE. Do those numbers maybe surprise you? It's a big distinction, isn't it, between 70 CE and 100 CE. So keeping that in mind, we realize that it took at least a period of 40 to 30 years minimum to have these Gospels written. Matthew and Luke come between these two, and just to give you a general time period though, this is when the first Gospel would have been written, and this is approximately when the last Gospel would have been written. And so you can see that there's probably a lot historically that would have been happening between these two fixed time points. I'm sure you have heard of a couple of things that have happened since. For example, the Great Fire that we will read later on about, actually in the next lesson, would have really influenced Mark. That would have occurred around 64 CE, and it destroyed a large portion of Rome. It was a fire that came and destroyed a lot of the little boroughs of the city. And that sort of sparked Nero, which was the Roman emperor at the time, his first institutionalized persecution of Christians. And so that in of itself is, wow, a big historical moment. But we are going to go maybe a little bit slower into this. That's something you can look forward to. Now we're going to rein it back, and we are going to be a little more precise about what this culture would have looked like, what the languages would have looked like, exactly how a person in that time period may have looked at these Gospels as contemporary literature, because for them, It would have been contemporary, wouldn't it? Absolutely. So considering a couple of the things that happen in this time period, you have to consider the general cultural appropriation of Hellenistic culture. Now we remember Hellenistic culture, as I said before, was a large part of Rome's culture as a whole. Hellenistic culture was really perpetuated by Alexander the Great. I'm sure we all have heard his name before, other than just in this class. The famous figure who was able to become a wonderful Roman conqueror, as he's even now known, legendary figure. And so he was very, very fond of Greek culture, was he not? Absolutely, we read about him in the last chapter. And so Alexander the Great, he loved Greek language. He loved Greek philosophy. He loved all these things about Greco thought. And he wanted to make sure, whenever he became that military and political figure, that the new kind of world order he had established would sort of operate in that Hellenistic culture, because he really loved Greek language and philosophy so much that he wanted it to be part of his subjects' lives. So that is why we need to remember that the language that this would have been written in, it would have been written in Greek. So we have a special form of Greek. It's a Greek that is not necessarily a high-class Greek. It is called Koine Greek. Koine Greek. And Koine Greek was an interesting language, and I'll compare it to English, for example. I know we have a couple students in this room that English is your second language, but maybe you'll be able to understand this example as well. It's applicable across many languages. For example, in Shakespeare's time, if you have read Shakespeare, Shakespeare wrote in a very elevated form of writing, a very elevated, sophisticated form of English. And if you remember, he wrote often in a poetic style called blank verse. And this poetic style of blank verse was often attributed in his writing to characters of the upper class. So in other words, we have this language that is largely affiliated with the members of high society, those who are wealthy. Well, Greek was similar. Greek had different dialects, you could say, different regional vernaculars, different dialects that would suit those of different socioeconomic class. For example, the ruling class may speak with a different vocabulary than the lower class may, or the merchant class, kind of the higher middle class for them would have spoken in a different dialect than the ruling class may have. So keeping that in mind, what do you think Koine Greek would have been? Would it have been spoken by the upper class, the lower class? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, Koine Greek actually would have been more of a common tongue. So in other words, it would have been the language of those necessarily not rich. In other words, the fishermen, the simple shopkeepers, the people that were fairly low in society, those who did not know a lot of higher elevated Greek, those who did not have a very high vocabulary in terms of how the other people in high society were speaking. And so here you have the more simplistic form of the language. And I'll return to Shakespeare to sort of finish this off. Shakespeare in his plays, he would have some of his lower class individuals, the members who were not as wealthy as other members of the play, and those characters would not be speaking in blank verse. They would just be speaking in typical prose. They would not be speaking in poetry. However, again, the members of high society, they would be speaking in an elevated language. They would be speaking in blank verse, which was poetry. So you had that language difference, even though technically they were both speaking English. Does that make sense? Okay, I know It's a really interesting way to think about language, but maybe you'll cover more of that inside your English or your linguistic class.